anecdotally, Mahmoud Abbas seems to have little credibility left with Palestinians and Palestinian society. New and emerging leaders are coming up through the ranks. What is your view on these potential replacement leaders and how they can affect the peace process with Israel?
At the end of the day, the leadership, especially in Palestinian society, can only reflect the will of the people. And there has to be a deep-rooted shift for some form of change, which I don't think we're seeing quite yet. In other words, the Palestinians have to sit down and say, okay, we want an independent state, and we're willing to recognize the Jewish nature of Israel. Otherwise, you can't expect Israel to negotiate the arrangements for its own funeral.
Right.
I'm not sure that's happened. The mythology of the right to return to all of Palestine, in inverted commas, still exists until today. And until they make that compromise, I don't think that Israel would be in a position to really further the peace process itself. But I hope it happens. You know, I hope it happens that we see. We've had Palestinians at my house. My kids played with Palestinian kids. It's cool. You know, one spoke Arabic, the other spoke English, and all they spoke about were iPhones. That's what it should be. You know, that's what it should be. The question is, how do we forward that? How do we progress that? And how do we create that understanding?
What is your idea? And how would you forward that understanding? Well, let's take youth. Let's take your children for that example. In Israel, I'm sure it's a little easier because you are interacting with Palestinians on a daily basis. Outside of Israel, it's a different story.
Right.
There's not that daily interaction. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't happen.
At the end of
the opportunities don't exist.
At the end of the day, whilst it may not be politically correct to say it, I truly believe that peace will come from leadership first. In other words, despite popular myth that leadership comes from the grassroots and builds its way up, whilst it's good to have conversations and dialogue and understanding, the leadership has to lead its people towards some form of compromise. And it's when we've seen is we've had leadership on the other side who've been willing to make that sacrifice, whether it was the Egyptians, whether it was the Jordanians. We nearly got it with the Syrians, by the way. That was the closest we got towards some form of peace with the Palestinians. Then that normality filters down. So I'm a strong believer, whilst perhaps it's not conventional political correctness to say, is that the peace comes up down rather than upwards.
Okay. How do you view Canada's role in this, in the peace process right now?
Canada is very important because it's a country which supports Israel, yet is also at the same time very staunch supporter in the whole peace process. So I think that it can certainly put pressure on the Palestinians. It can put pressure on the international community to listen. One of the messages which I've been saying in Canada is, be critical of Israel. That's okay. We always joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. In Israel, we have, as you know, two Israelis, 4 opinions, 5 political parties, and a change of government. National sport is having elections. So absolutely, be critical, but be fair. And I think that we're seeing that in Canada, that there's that balance of trying to understand the past of the Jewish people, yet at the same time, trying to move processes forward. I think what we're seeing is a change, not necessarily in the situation, but certainly it's a change in who's listening. Okay, so we're seeing a couple of things, especially in Canada, and especially on the universities. One, students are different. A Jewish student today is different than they were 5 years ago. They're much more concerned with their studies, and much more concerned with getting employment, seem to have less time, and there seems to be less of a passion for Israel. Okay, so the audience today, who is, if they're 18, work it out. They just remember Bill Clinton.
Right.
That's that's a very different generation. That's number one. Second of all, I think Palestinian tactics are changing as well. Whilst we still have the fanatics of George Galloway, Finkelstein, and these people who come and visit. Palestinian propaganda is changing in what they're doing, is that they're saying we want to be more liberal. We want to approach the liberal agenda, so that what they come out with is BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign. And what Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign does is it dresses itself in this form of, we want to be progressive, we're liberal, we're understanding. But the reality is they're against a 2-state solution. and they support a one-state solution. And it's not just about ending occupation, it's about ending Zionism.
Right.
And that's well documented. So their tactics, I think, is changing as well. We have to deal with that at the same time.
So what's the counterstroke to that?
The counterstroke to that, one, is showing what BDS is. Two, is to show that if we were really interested in moving towards peace, whilst I say peace comes from leadership down, we can still have many of the projects which are taking place. One of the biggest institutes in Israel, which is the Shimon Peres Center for Peace, President of Israel, as you know, runs activities, hundreds of activities every year, where exactly as we were discussing, Israelis and Palestinians are meeting and talking to each other. You have universities trying to cooperate on studies. You have joint medicine. You have Palestinian doctors being trained at Hadassah Hospital. Those type of projects, I think, are useful. Having said that, the big peace will come between leaders when we have leaders who have some form of ambition to move forward.